study of latte, didn't you? It continued after this period, did it?
Well, I went back. No, really my study on which the dissertation was based was over a 3-year period. I did a long study, a joint study with Bernard when we were in Kenya, and that was about over 18 years of the Mberi in Kenya.
How do you spell
Mbere, Mberi. So when I was at the University of Ghana, I met David Apter, political scientist who'd done studies in Ghana and Uganda. He was from the University of California at Berkeley, and he ran the first ever Peace Corps training program for a group of 40 teachers to come out to Ghana under the Peace Corps. In the second year, in 1962, he invited me to direct this Peace Corps training program at the University of California at Berkeley. So that was my first time in California, and I was able to invite faculty. I invited Bernard, not just because he was my friend, but more importantly, he had spent a year in Ghana as a geographer, and he was qualified to teach about the geography of Ghana. And we ran the 6-week training course for the young teachers who were going out to Ghana. They were all university graduates, and they went out for a 2-year spell. As a result of that, David Apter suggested that I come to the University of California. He said rightly that I couldn't stay on in Ghana forever, and I did want to join Bernard, obviously, who was finishing his PhD. So the following year I had an appointment with Apter and Seymour Martin Lipset, who were directors of the International Institute of International Studies at Berkeley. I had an administrative post, so I stayed at Berkeley. Bernard was still at Indiana.
You say you had an administrative post?
Well, it was not an academic post.
Yeah.
I was an administrator. I was secretary and really administrator of the institute, which had a number of research grants. I arranged conferences. I did a couple of edited books. I built up African Studies department. I made sure the library had good holdings in African Studies, that sort of thing. Bernard was still working on his PhD at Indiana University. At this time my mother was getting frail, and she had joined me, so we had a house, a very pleasant house in Berkeley. Bernard joined us for all the vacations, the short and long vacations. He would come over. But after 3 years at Berkeley, Apter advised me to get an academic post, which I wanted to. At Berkeley there was no opening for me, partly because David Apter was persona non grata with the anthropologists for some reasons, which arcane reasons, and partly because they said they had people who covered, they had enough African anthropologists. So I applied at one of the other California universities at Santa Barbara, which is 2 hours north of Los Angeles, of UCLA. And they were a smaller campus. At first I thought it was, I had dismissed it in my mind as a surfing college, which it is. There's good surfing there, but it also is one of the better of the smaller colleges, and I was very happy there, and probably happier than I would have been at Berkeley, because we had a lot of freedom. Charles Erasmus, who was the first chairman, believed in letting people, after our introductory courses were covered, we could teach what we liked. He said that way the students would get good teaching. I succeeded Charles after 2 years as chairman. That was in 1969, and that was a year of increasing student protests against the Vietnam War. In our Department of Anthropology, we had hired a young anthropologist, archaeologist, to teach South American prehistory on a 2-year contract. He became very radicalized, and in his last year he said grades were capitalist emblems, and he was giving students A+ for a doll of a Vietnamese child bombed by the Americans. And so we did not surprisingly, we did not renew his contract after 2 years, but the students said that we had fired him, and particularly I as chair became the villain, and half the students signed a petition demanding that Bill Allen, the radical, be reinstated and that I be fired. And when Bernard and I were driving to campus one day, there was a huge banner which read, fuck Brokensha, which wasn't a very cheery welcome. And it was ironic because Bill Allen and I were probably the most radical in our department. We often found each other at rallies protesting against the war, but I worked, I think I always have, within the system. I try to change things from within. I don't believe in bringing everything tumbling down. But after that I was bruised. It was a difficult year, and I had full support from my colleagues and from some, not all the students. But I decided to go away, and Bernard encouraged me. Bernard by then had moved down to Santa Barbara. He'd got a post. It was ironic, when I left Berkeley, he was offered a post at Berkeley in what was one of the most prestigious departments in the USA of geography, with Carl Ortwin Sauer, whose brand of geography, human geography, was very congenial for Bernard. But in order to join me, he came down to Santa Barbara to join a much less significant department of geography, which was not congenial to him, and in fact after a couple of years he resigned from that, and in order to stay with me took a library degree. He did a 2-year Masters of Library Science in 1 year, and then there were no posts available and he was overqualified. The librarians found him threatening with all his degrees, and eventually he, which I'll come on to, he became a lecturer in the newly formed Department of Environmental Studies, which was formed in about 1974 after an oil spill in Santa Barbara galvanized people, made them more aware of the environmental hazards. And after Bernard had been in that department a year, I joined him. I was able, American universities are more flexible. I was able to get 50% time in anthropology and 50% in environmental studies, where Bernard and I taught a joint 3-quarter course on environmental problems of the Third World. Most of our colleagues concentrated on North America, with a bit about Europe and Japan, but they left, most of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. They didn't deal with it. So we did that for, until we retired in 1989, so it would have been about 10 years we taught together, which was a good experience. Quite difficult when you have personal and professional close relationships, but it worked out well. Bernard handled mostly the physical aspects, and I the social ones of the environment. Meantime, I was teaching, and it was a lot of emphasis on teaching. I taught courses on social change in Africa, on minorities, which started off with apartheid, and then I looked at discrimination across the world, blacks in Brazil, Muslims in what was then Russia, the untouchables, Dalit in India. There were many candidates, and it was a good education for me as well. I also taught from the beginning a graduate course on development. And it was odd, at this time when I started, I think I was one of the few who taught such a course, probably in the world. And now any university, certainly in Britain, would have something like that. And it was interesting that my colleagues, not all of them understood my interest, but they supported me. We had, under the influence of Charles Erasmus, the first chairman, he had encouraged us to tolerate each other. I thought one of my colleagues was too much an armchair anthropologist and should go out in the field. I'm sure some of them thought I was quaint, not only for my interests, but in a department of 20 there were only 2 other foreigners. There was a Mexican, Palermo, and an archaeologist, Brian Fagan. I was the only practicing Christian as a Catholic of the group, and I was the only gay in the department. So I think it says a lot that some people have the idea that America and American institutions are so rigid and doctrinaire and fundamentalist, but I found a great acceptance of diversity, certainly in this environment. And many of my students, most of whom I'm still in touch with, many of my students went into either to teach development at universities or to posts in the World Bank or Oxfam or something development related. And this was at a time when academic jobs were scarce. And that's one reason, of course, for the growing popularity of development. The other is an increased awareness that anthropology does have a contribution to make. At the same time, I was a director for 25 years of a non-profit Institute for Development Anthropology with two American anthropologists, Michael Horowitz and Thea Scudder from the California Institute of Technology, and Horowitz from State University of Binghamton, New York. And as I say, for 25 years, we were a missionary enterprise in a secular way. We were trying to persuade the World Bank and the United States Agency for International Development and other bodies that development projects were more likely to succeed if they asked people like us. And we had a roster at its height of 400 anthropologists, many of whom came from developing countries, who were available for consultancies and advice. The United States Agency for International Development, I think in 1978, introduced a requirement that all projects had to have a social soundness analysis. Before that, they'd have to have an environmental analysis, which was accepted. The social analysis was resisted by the economists and the lawyers who tend to still to dominate world development, but accepted, and the results showed that the projects were much more likely to succeed. Ideally, anthropologists should be involved right at the beginning in drawing up the program, during the program, in monitoring it, afterwards in evaluating, and it's very seldom that we've been able to have this follow through from beginning to end. But after spending my professional lifetime in this field, I'm convinced that of the righteousness of our cause, and I think slowly more and more agencies are accepting. The USAID at one time had employed 60 anthropologists, but unfortunately many of them became bureaucrats willy-nilly. They became sucked into the system, seldom spent time in the field. The director, when I left, of USAID was not an anthropologist, but had been a Peace Corps volunteer. He'd spent 2 years teaching in Peru. So this makes an enormous difference. As I say, so many Americans are quite insular and have little idea of abroad. So there was a breath of fresh air coming in through us and Peace Corps volunteers and so on.
Is there more you'd like to say about development anthropology? Because I know it's your main field of interest, or is that...
Yes, well, just briefly, as I said, there was some, I found less so in the USA than in Britain. In Britain, some leading anthropologists remained skeptical. And in fact, I went in 1982 to 1984. I spent in London as director of the University of California Student Exchange Program. We have about 200 students in 15 universities in the UK and Ireland. And Isaac Shapira encouraged me to get an affiliation with LSE, just so I could use the library and attend seminars and so on. And I was told at a meeting to discuss this, I was going to be an honorary fellow or whatever they called it, there was some objection, not to me personally, but because I was known to be doing development. And did we really want to do development? But anyway, I was accepted, and I met no personal animosity. But it seemed to me quaint then, still does. I would say, personally for me, it's been a fulfilling, I know being able to help in various projects, if nothing, making the impact less harsh than it would have been. I mean, this seems like a lame excuse, but for example, in resettlement, my colleague Ted Scudder is probably the world expert on the forced resettlement of people, particularly as a result of man-made dams. I mean, the numbers run into the millions. The Three Gorges Dam in China alone displaced 1.5 million. Scudder was involved in that from the beginning with the Canadian contractors, and through him more provision was made for the people. Their lives are still miserable. They've been disruptive. They've been relocated, but more provision had been made for services, for schools, for a number of other things to make that relocation more difficult. We're not just band-aid people, though I do believe that we have had some influence on the policies, which is the important part of World Bank and others. The World Bank was lucky in having as their chief sociologist for many years is a Romanian Michael Cernia, who recently retired, CERNEA. He wrote a book called Putting People First, and he really believes in this, and he's been responsible, with some prodding from us, in recruiting many anthropologists to senior positions in the World Bank. So I would say I'm proud of that things have changed a little. Some anthropologists, Arturo Escobar is one, James Ferguson, former student of mine, another, are very skeptical about development, and their line seems to be that development is fundamentally disruptive, and fundamentally it's wrong. Many of the people like Escobar come from a rather left-wing Marxist point of view. Development is run by capitalists, for capitalists, better to have nothing to do with it. That hasn't been my line. Going back to Rhodesia, I mean the government, even before Ian Smith, was fairly racist, but we worked within it, Bernard and I, in our different ways to make some changes within. So I've always been a gradualist. I'd like to say something about the other field work. And
yes.
As a result of wanting to go abroad, I accepted a post in Kenya as an area evaluator, it was called, for a special rural development program. This was a program run in 6 different areas of Kenya, chosen to be representative. The area where I went to, and I asked for it, was low potential, and it was near the Tana River. Parts of it were semi-arid. I asked to be sent there because I knew there would be no African sociologist or political scientist who would want to go to this bleak area, and it was familiar to me from Handeni, where I'd been stationed in Tanganyika, quite similar, and I like these marginal areas.
How's Handeni spelled?
Handeni. So I went there, and fortunately Bernard was able to take leave and to spend, I spent 15 months there the first time, he spent 9 months with me, and while he was there he suggested, I was then evaluating, I was employed by the government of Kenya and the University of Nairobi to do an evaluation. I won't go into the details of the program. There were some successes, but again it wasn't adequately planned. They made mistakes such as wanting the few pastoralists in the area to form communal ranches. Nobody asked the pastoralists. Nobody took advantage of this great wealth of indigenous knowledge that they have. So the group ranches, of course, failed, as they always do. But apart from that, personally it was a great experience for us, and at Bernard's suggestion we applied to do a joint study of social and ecological change in this Mberi division of Kenya. And we were able to get a National Science Foundation grant, well 2 grants in fact, and we came out for 2 periods of about a year each in the 1970s. And then we went back again whenever we could in the 1980s. So over an 18-year period we monitored the changes, and we focused on changes in vegetation, because at the beginning we noticed, because the people told us, that deforestation was occurring at quite a rapid rate. For a number of reasons, partly the population was growing, so fields were being cleared for crops, partly because under the development program charcoal production was encouraged, and this meant that the hardwoods were being cut down. I remember once Bernard and I he was photographing a man who was chopping down a hardwood tree near a stream, And he looked at us and he said, "I know what you're thinking." He said this in Swahili. "But if I don't chop down the tree, who will feed my children? Who will feed my children? Will you?" I mean, he's making the point that he had no other way of getting cash. He knew it was environmentally degrading, and that taught us a lesson, not to be too disapproving. But we did, and we published a 2-volume book. One was a botanical dictionary, which Bernard did, of all the trees. He was a geographer and became a self-taught botanist. We were very impressed by the indigenous knowledge. This was my introduction really to indigenous knowledge of the people. We would go around with schoolboys and schoolgirls, and in walking, at first all I would see is a forest, trees, and they would say, "There we are, Mr. David, you are asking about that tree," and they would point, and all I would see were trees, and they'd say, "Come on," and they would show me, "This is a tree which is good for when you have a cut or to make a chair or whatever use it was." And the old men knew even more, and the women knew a great deal about firewood. And we became instant pioneers in what was called social forestry. In 1975, Eric Ekholm wrote a book called The Other Energy Crisis. The main energy crisis was oil, of course, in 1974, but the other energy crisis was the deforestation, the disappearance of woodlands. So the vegetation it was a neat focus of our work, how the houses were no longer made of wood, but they were roofed with corrugated iron. How when we first went there, a lot of the old people were dressed in skins, and nearly all the household utensils, instruments, weapons were made from the trees. And within our period of study, that all disappeared. The forestry department's response, again, was to encourage communal woodlots, which seldom work, because the assumption here, which I've been fighting all my professional life, is that out there is a community which is cooperative. And this, of course, was the main reason for the collapse of Nyereri's Ujamaa program, which was founded on the belief that people are cooperative. They're not. I mean, they'll cooperate within a small family group or one based on religion, but a village is seldom. There are always feuds and factions. And also, when woodlots were established, very often the women did all the work, were expected to, of watering them and guarding them and weeding them. But when it came to selling them, the men expected to get the results. So we, in and out of season, Bernard and I were encouraging the foresters to ask the local people what they wanted, what they knew about trees. One example is of one tree. It was a Melia volkensis, which we had seen growing in straight rows, obviously planted by local farmers. And we asked one of the foresters, who in fact was a British forester left over from colonial days, who was very snooty, and he said, "Oh, it's far too difficult to germinate." So they were planting easy trees like eucalyptus and pines, which the local people didn't like, weren't much good to them. So we asked an old man who had a row of 20 Melia, and we said, "How do you plant these?" And he was very scathing. He took a pinch of snuff, and he said, "I'm surprised. I thought you white people knew everything. Every Karithi is an uncircumcised boy. It's a very insulting thing. Every Karithi knows that. You follow the goats around. The goats eat the seed from the marah, and the enzymes do the work, and then you plant the excreted seed." And we told the forester that. I don't think he believed us. But they could easily have collected these and planted the Melia, which is a multi-purpose tree. It provides shade. The goats eat the fruit. It's a good hardwood tree for building. And compared to eucalypt, it's 10 times better. So as a result of that, in 1980, I co-edited with Mike Warren, an American friend of mine, whom I had first met when he was a Peace Corps volunteer. I taught him. And he was very much interested in indigenous knowledge, and we edited a book called Indigenous Knowledge and Development in 1980. And this was one of the first of that sort. We had a collection of people, many of whom came under the influence of Robert Chambers at Sussex. I had known Robert in Kenya working on the Special Rural Development Program, and he brought in 6 or 7 writers, and we wrote about a range of instances where indigenous knowledge never supplemented Western knowledge, but where it was a very useful add-on to work that any development should be worked on both. We had some difficulty persuading not only the World Bank people but African scientists. One Kenyan had spent some years at Utah State and came back with a PhD in agriculture, very high tech. And when I talked to him about indigenous knowledge, he laughed and he said, "David, you think I must go back and ask my illiterate old grandmother?" And I said, "Exactly." But I don't think I convinced him.
Okay, so you retired in 1989, but I'm sure you didn't stop doing all the things that you've been doing before.
No, I retired in 1989 and we decided to move to England, having spent 2 years there with the education with our Californian exchange students. Bernard, although he'd been born in England, had spent all his life outside. I'd only known England in my student years at Cambridge and Oxford, but those 2 years showed us a different England where we thought we'd like to go. And also Bernard had been a lecturer. He was not entitled a temporary year-to-year lecturer. He was entitled neither to a pension nor to health care, and he already had some health problems, so we thought it would be better to move to England where he could use the National Health Service. I should say that by 1995 the University of California, it was a great boon to us, allowed me to put Bernard as, it's a clumsy phrase, a same-sex domestic partner. They said, had we been together more than 2 years, and I said, what about 40 or whatever it was, and they allowed me to put him on my medical aid, which made a great difference, and also he was on the pension had he survived me, which he did not. So we spent 10 years in Britain, during which we, sometimes together, sometimes I on my own, gave talks at universities in Finland and Germany and Crete, and a few in England. I was active for some time with people like Sandra Wallman in the group on applied anthropology, attended seminars when they were of interest, particularly at SOAS and LSE, but not heavily involved. Bernard and I had decided when we retired that we wouldn't stick to our respective disciplines but explore the world. So we did a lot of traveling to far distances. We went to Europe many times. We went in England. We did a lot of traveling. We went to we did a lot of culture, opera, concerts, plays, and enjoyed. So I can't say that it wasn't unlike. I was by no means a Firth who remained producing an article a week, it seemed, until he was 100. And then in 1999 we went to South Africa, again for Bernard's health. He had problems, heart bypass, and we decided it would be better to go to South Africa, which we had visited together several times. I'd always hoped, although I'd despaired at times, of coming back to my native South Africa. I am 4th generation South African. I feel I belong there. So we settled at Cape Town in Fishhook and lived there together for 5 years, and then Bernard died mercifully very quickly. We had lunch 2 days before he died, and then he died peacefully 2 years ago after a stroke. I will stay on there. He knew he was dying, and Bernard told me, don't mope, make a life, get on with your own life, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm on my way around the world. I do remain somewhat involved. Martin West and Muggsy Spiegel, who of the University of Cape Town, arranged for me to be an honorary professor in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Cape Town. It's a very good small department. Owen Sichoni, my Zambian colleague, is very active in development. Occasionally I talk to his class if he's away, but otherwise I attend seminars, try to look wise, and enjoy the contact with the young. I find it a stimulating department where they often discuss issues which they should, I think, in South Africa, such as health and AIDS and poverty and housing and race. It's curious, I think there's some tiptoeing around the whole subject, whole topic of race in South Africa. Because of those apartheid years, people are afraid of being labelled a race. Even if you point to some obvious social differences between black and white, you have to be very careful how you phrase it. But despite that, it's I much enjoy it. I go in once for the weekly seminar, and I think the piece I did on Monica Wilson will be my last publication. I don't feel the need, or I don't have anything more to say on that.
Well, you've had a very, very full life, and it's been fascinating listening. You touched on a number of people who earlier on in my life also influenced me, and I wondered whether we could just end by you giving a few words or pen portrait of one or two of them, perhaps starting with Evans Pritchard, who you mentioned was the most influential person in a way in your life, or at least academic influence. What sort of man was he, and what sort of mind was he?
Well, I found I seldom had long discussions about anthropology with him. When we came out together, when we travelled on the Union Castle liner from Britain to South Africa in 1951, he and I would often end up standing on deck, and he would talk about and I encouraged him about his early days in Egypt and his wartime period in Cyrenaica, which I loved, and I could listen to that a long time. We would talk together about whatever interested. He knew he was just I've heard other people say he was difficult, he was arrogant. I found him none of those things. He was always encouraging. I think there was the link which I mentioned, that his wife was South African. He hated the apartheid government, and it was difficult for him with his wife's family because his father-in-law had been a High Commissioner for South Africa in London. But he liked South Africa. No, I found him forthright and encouraging, and then shortly before his death, Bernard and I exchanged houses from Santa Barbara and spent a summer in Oxford. And he was beginning to fail then, and we would often meet him at
in the 1970s.
In the early 1970s. I think he died in 73,
Yes.
so it would have been about 71. And we would meet him at the Randolph or one of the pubs, and he was drinking more than he should. And Bernard was very good with him. He would say, "Come on, let's have another drink." And Bernard would say, "No, come on, EP, off we go home," which I couldn't possibly have said to him, but he was docile and he would go. He met Bernard early on. I took him to meet him, and there was never any problem. I wouldn't have expected any. I think he knew before I did that I was gay, and he was very fond of Bernard and encouraged us. I enjoyed also walking around the parks with him. Whenever I visited Oxford, he'd say, "Come on, we walk around the parks." So I found him, as I say, I can't add anything to him as an anthropologist, but as a warm human being. He was wonderful.
But you mentioned a rather nice incident when you knew Polly Hill, and Polly was at a dinner party and heard that EP was coming out.
This was at when the University of Ghana was celebrating its independence as a university, instead of being a university college, and EP had been rather sidelined in favour of all the East Europeans who were coming out, and he was quite disgruntled, rightly, because he had made more of a contribution, and he wasn't in a mood for serious talk. And at dinner, Polly Hill kept on badgering him about what he really thought about so-and-so, and EP was countering with light talk about the birds in the Sudan, pretending he'd understood. And eventually he turned to me and said, "David, who is this impossible woman you put next to me?" Which I'm afraid Polly heard.
It was in his deaf ear as well.
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, moving on to another, the next brother, so to speak, in the famous three brothers, Meyer Fortes. Did you know Meyer?
Quite well, yes. He was not as easy for me to get to know as EP, but very encouraging to me as a South African. It might be worth mentioning that when I was a a graduate student at Oxford, there were 6 chairs of social anthropology in Britain, and 3 of them were held by South Africans. Shap at LSE, Max at Manchester, and Meyer at Cambridge a bit later when he left to go to Cambridge. And it was Meyer, whom I mentioned, who was very sympathetic to my vacillating between administration and anthropology, and he and John Beattie encouraged me. In fact, Meyer arranged for me to be interviewed by Sir Roger Firth, who was head of the Colonial Service, and obviously said, "This is a good chap, you know, look after him," because he gave me an easy time, and gave him my first choice of country, which was Tanganyika, because of John Beattie. I had decided I wouldn't go to Kenya because the Mau Mau was, well, there were signs that it was going to begin, and I didn't want to get involved after South Africa in another black versus white conflict.
The other Africanist who you got to know quite well was Lucy Mayer.
Yes, Lucy I didn't know so well, but I admired her. I'd had dinner with her a few times, and she was important as a pioneer in social administration, in applied anthropology. I think she had a difficult time because of this, as a woman too. It wasn't easy in those days. But the little I saw of her, she was always most encouraging, and she was a model in a way, for she got on, she seemed to get on well. She, when she went out to the colonies they were then with Africa, she was outspoken and sensible, I thought. And I was very pleased when the Royal Anthropological Institute instigated the Lucy Mayer Medal for contributions to applied anthropology, and I regard this as one of my achievements. I nominated my colleague Thea Scudder for the first, and he was a very strong contender, and he got it, and he couldn't come to Britain, so I was able to present it at a professional meeting in Tucson, Arizona. He well deserved it.
The other woman, Africanist, who I got to know a bit and you must have known, was Audrey Richards.
Yes, Audrey I got to know in a short time quite well. She came to Ghana for something or other, and I was then working at Latte. I wasn't at the university, it must have been in a vacation, and she asked if she could come out, and she spent 5 days with me, and it was wonderful and shaming to go round with her. And I've had this experience with several anthropologists, partly in Kenya, particularly in Ghana. It was only a 45-minute drive from the university, and whenever any visiting anthropologist came, I suggested that rather than talk at Legon, they come to Latte and we'd walk round. So E.P. came, Aidan Southall came, Charles France, many, and every time in walking around with them, they would say, "Who's that? Why is he or she doing that? Who lives there?" And Audrey was the most searching of all. I kept a notebook of things, you know, I'd seen every day and hadn't noticed or hadn't thought to ask.
It was a wonderful anthropologist.
And she also, I had working with me then a young German, Agnes Klingschön, who was doing her master's on children at Latte. And she'd got stuck, as many of us do, in field work and was very depressed. And Audrey really sorted her out and made her see that she knew a great deal. Agnes was feeling she knew nothing. And as a result of that, Agnes stayed on and did a doctorate of women at Latte. And Audrey was just marvellous with her. And then my last meeting, as it were, with Audrey, I was in London and came here to King's College for her memorial, and sat next to a young man who was one of her villagers, English villagers, and it was wonderful hearing him talk about her.
Oh, that's lovely anecdotes. Well, there's so many more, but I think...
Could we talk Shap?
Shap, yes.
Briefly about Shap. I met Shap when I was in Rhodesia. He was friendly with Hugh Ashton in Bulawayo. He came out every summer for a couple of months and stayed with the Ashtons. He encouraged me to write a history of Rhodesia, which I started on, but it was hopeless. I never finished it. And then when Bernard and I lived in London in the 1990s, I had a ritual. Jean Lafontaine explained it to me. I would go to the White House at 5 o'clock, phone and say, "It's David," and he would say, "Come up." I'd usually bring him a bottle of whiskey or whatever else he wanted, and we'd chat and have a drink or two until 6, and then I'd say, "It's time for the news," and we would leave. And that was very important. I think he enjoyed it. I did. It was once a month or so, and very often we invited him to lunch at our flat in Kennington, and he didn't like too big a group, but 6 or 8, and he enjoyed his few whiskies, a little frail, but again he was one who encouraged me, and particularly when I was younger and starting on this. I think we all need a boost in confidence, and I've been lucky in meeting people like that.